Chapter 9 of In Kent with Charles Dickens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Ruth Golding. In Kent with Charles Dickens by Thomas Frost. Chapter 9. As the train rushed through the cuttings to Dover, recollections of a former journey from Canterbury to the old Cinque-Port rose vividly before my mind. Then I had left the ancient city on the top of a coach, and a shower having laid the dust before we started, my eyes were refreshed with the cool greenery of the Bishopsbourne woods and Barham Downs, and the blue ridge on which the white spire of Ash Church rises on the left, and the more distant hills stretching south-easterly from Wye to Lyminge on the right. Now we obtained only momentary glimpses of the scenery we passed through from the narrow windows of a stuffy carriage, and those only at intervals, much of the line running along the bottom of deep cuttings in the chalk hills, the almost perpendicular sides of which rise so high in some places that the sky can be seen only by protruding the head from the window. Nothing to see, even while the daylight lasted, but those white walls, with a brief glimpse now and then of a rich cultivated country with blue hills in the distance, while an incessant rattle of railway joinery, varied by the harsh grating of railway mechanism and the shrill shriek of the railway whistle, rendered intelligible conversation impracticable. So I leaned back in my corner, and while the curate made an attempt to read a morning newspaper which he had bought at the bookstall at Canterbury Station, and my other companions slept, passed in review the traditions concerning the haunted passage in the precinct. The superstition that made death within the year the doom of any unfortunate person who encountered the ghost of Nell Cook was haunting me, like the ghosts of sounds that so troubled the mind of a certain vicar that, on one Sunday morning, he was obliged to go into the garden and sing the Lass of Gowrie before going to church, lest he should give out, instead of a hymn, "'Twas on a summer afternoon," and on another actually added to the sentence beginning, "When the wicked man," the fish-hawker's cry, "All alive, alive, oh!" I could not get out of my head the man who was gibbeted on Chatham Downs, and whose fate was attributed by tradition to his having seen the ghost in the dark entry. I had heard of that apparition, and of the superstition associated with it, from a Canterburyan young lady many years before, even before Barham had made it the subject of one of the inimitable Ingoldsby Legends. But that was before the cacoethes scribendi had brought out a periodical eruption of fiction. Now the idea of a tale was working in my mind, and before the train reached Dover, the characters and incidents were dimly outlined. It was growing dark when we were whirled through or under the bare wide downs near Dover, over which David Copperfield trudged, weary and footsore, hungry and ill-clad, on the occasion of his visit to his aunt, Miss Betsy Trotwood. Clouds had gathered during the evening, and when we alighted at the Priory station and sniffed the briny air of the Strait, they increased the obscurity of the hour so much that the night was more than ordinarily dark. Our walk of 25 miles from Chatham to Canterbury had left my companions no desire to proceed farther by foot than was necessary that night, but I could not repress my desire to see the sea, and, dark as the night was, I strolled down to the beach before retiring to rest, and smoked a cigarette upon one of the black piles. The scene was sublime in its wild, weird dreariness and solitude. The dry seaweed that hung about the piles rustled in the light breeze, as if responding to the hoarse murmuring of the tide upon the shingle. The smooth sea stretched far away from me, with only a line of faint light separating its darkness from the darkness of the sky. A bright speck, like a distant star, shone upon the horizon, and away to the right there gleamed another, and these I knew to be the lights on Calais Pierhead and on Cape Grisnez. but no sound of human life reached my ears, and those lights were so distant that they aided rather than diminished the effect of the dark and solemn sea. Lodgings had been found for the curate and myself near the house of our friend's brother-in-law, and there, before retiring to rest, I sketched the outlines of the following story. The Doomed of the Dark Entry. A quiet old city is Canterbury. Its old houses, its ivied churches and gateways, its venerable cathedral, its solemn cloisters, give it an old-world air suggestive of its having been cut off from the rest of England for 2 or 3 centuries. The railway seems an incongruity, a discord, an anachronism. But for that, there would be nothing of an architectural nature about the place to indicate to a Canterburyan Rip Van Winkle, who had fallen asleep 100 years ago, that any changes had taken place during his long nap. Such care has been taken in making changes necessitated by time that they should not jar with old associations and old-world notions, that Rip would not observe that the Arundel Tower and All Saints' Church have been restored, while the Norman architecture of the new building in which the Archiepiscopal Library is located harmonises well enough with its surroundings. As Canterbury presents itself to the eye of the tourist to-day, so, therefore, was it seen by Walter Gilson just a century ago, as he sauntered along the shady side of the High Street, with his friend and former schoolfellow Arthur Dorling. Young Gilson was an orphan, and his father having died in indigent circumstances, though he had once had a good business in the city, he had been indebted from childhood to an uncle for a home. Uncle Barton being in tolerably affluent circumstances, his orphan nephew had received what was then esteemed a good education, had been taken into his office, and was generally expected to succeed him in the business. "You're a lucky fellow," said young Dorling, cracking nuts as he spoke, and throwing the shells into the road. "You come out of every trouble like a duck out of water, none the worse for it. Left an orphan at an early age, you were adopted by a well-to-do uncle. Making your appearance at the Guildhall on a charge of, what was it, Walter? Embezzlement? Forgery?" "Let that alone, Arthur," said Gilson, reddening. "It is time that was forgotten." "So be it," rejoined Dorling. "I meant no offence, Walter. I was only going to observe that you got over that as you have over every other trouble or difficulty, and here you are, soon to be your uncle's son-in-law, and some day his successor in the business, and finally the inheritor of all he possesses. I say again, you are a lucky fellow, Walter." "So lucky that I sometimes fear it will not last," said Gilson, unconsciously giving expression to a pagan notion with which his education had not been classical enough to make him acquainted. "Why not?" asked Dorling. "That is a question I can't answer," replied Gilson, with the cloud still upon his rather well-favoured countenance. "I wish I could. It would be something to know the quarter from which the blow is to come." "My eye and Betty Martin!" exclaimed a voice, at the sound of which Gilson started perceptibly. "Do my eyes behold Walter Gilson? And like a gentleman, I declare." Both the young men turned instantly towards the half-open doors of the George and Dragon, whence the voice proceeded, and beheld Gilson with ill-concealed fear and openly expressed disgust, Dorling with mingled curiosity and surprise, a shabbily dressed and dissipated-looking man, a few years the senior of both. "Bless my stars, how proud we're getting!" exclaimed the shabby man, stepping into the street. "Makes believe he don't know me. His old pal, Miles Delaney." "Oh, Delaney," said Gilson, as if he had not recognised him, and in an unmistakable tone of coldness and dislike. "So you have come back to the old city?" he added, on finding that the fellow was unwilling to accept the cut. "Yes," returned Delaney. "I am a rolling stone, you know." "And you seem to be another instance of the proverb," observed Gilson. "Well, we can't all be as lucky as you have been, Walter Gilson," returned Delaney. "And you didn't seem likely to stand in the shoes you do now when I last saw you, at the Guildhall, you know. But you got out of that mess very tidily, and now the first one I asks about when I comes back to Canterbury is you. 'How's young Gilson a getting on?' says I. And says Andrew Jobson, 'Why, he's going up to the top, going to marry Rose Barton and have all the old man's tin, and die Mayor of Canterbury.'" "I don't feel at all flattered by your interest in me, Delaney," said Gilson, with a displeased look. "Well, well," ejaculated Delaney, with an aggrieved air. "It's the way of the world. When a fellow is down, kick him. But you'll stand a quart of ale and give me a halfpenny to fill my pipe, won't you, Walter?" Gilson, wishing to be rid of the fellow, put a shilling in his hand and passed on. On his return to his uncle's house, a note was given him by the servant, which she said had been left by a shabby-looking man with red whiskers, and which contained only the following brief communication, written upon dirty paper in an almost illegible scrawl. "I want to see you very particular. I didn't like to say what I got to say afore young Dorling. Come to the Cloisters after dark. It's about the cheque you was had up to the Guildhall about." There was no signature, but its tenor left no doubt in his mind of its having been written by Miles Delaney, with whose not very prepossessing personal appearance that of the bearer corresponded. He became a shade paler as he read the last sentence, but the soft silvery tones of his cousin's voice reached his ear from the passage, and crushing the note in his hand, he thrust it into his pocket. There was a cloud upon his brow when he left the house that evening, just as the oil lamps in the High Street were being lighted, and proceeded towards the cathedral. A stern resolve shone in his dark eyes, and his lips were compressed, the entire expression of his countenance indicating that, with the utmost unwillingness to hold any intercourse with Delaney, he felt constrained to meet him, and that, while he apprehended evil, he was resolved not to attempt to avert it by any dishonourable concession. 9 o'clock sounded from one grey old tower after another as he entered the Cloisters, which he walked round twice, the first time quickly, the second more slowly, without meeting Delaney or any one else. 3/4 of an hour elapsed before he left the Cloisters, hurrying with long strides towards the Green Court, with a dark flush upon his brow, his nostrils dilated, and his lips quivering as with unwonted excitement. As he reached the gloomy covered passage leading into the brick walk, he stopped suddenly, gazing into the obscurity before him with widely dilated eyes. Just within the passage known as the Dark Entry, he could dimly discern the shadowy outlines of a female figure, clad in a fashion which had been obsolete for a couple of centuries, standing motionless, with the head bent down, the arms drooping, the hands clasped before. For a few moments Walter Gilson stood as motionless as the figure. Then he advanced a pace or two and gazed again. The figure moved not, and seemed unaware of his presence. A strange awe crept over him, and his feet seemed rooted to the broad flagstones on which he stood. Once or twice he strove to address the apparition, but his tongue seemed to be glued to his mouth. "Who are you?" he at length contrived to articulate, but his voice sounded strange even to himself. There was no response. The head remained bowed, the arms straight and rigid, the white fingers clasped. "Speak!" he exclaimed. Not a sound came from the pale lips, not the slightest movement could be discerned, but the outlines of the figure began to grow more indistinct, and in a few moments it had faded to just a perceptible luminousness, which could be described only as a white shadow. This too faded out, and only darkness filled the space where it had been. With a face as pale as that of the figure which had vanished, with every nerve trembling, and a cold perspiration distilling from every pore, Walter Gilson crept past the spot on which the apparition had stood, not without the awe-inspiring apprehension that it might reappear in close contiguity to him, and then hurried into the brick walk. "Walter!" exclaimed Rose Barton, regarding him on his entrance with an expression of mingled solicitude and surprise. "How pale you are! Are you ill? What has happened?" "Nothing, dear," he replied, impressing a kiss upon her fair cheek. "And I am not ill, but I have been walking fast, and I met Miles Delaney, and he was insolent, and it has excited me a little." He said nothing about the apparition, because there was a superstition connected with it which made him unwilling to alarm her by associating it with himself. There was a tradition more than 200 years old that the ghost said to haunt the dark entry had been the cook of a priest who lived in the house close to which it always appeared, and that she had poisoned her master and a lady, and been buried alive beneath a flagstone of the pavement. Her ghost, it was said, had haunted the spot ever since, and whoever saw it was doomed to die within the year. The story obtained almost universal credence in the city, and though Walter Gilson had been bold enough to thread the dark entry that night, he had been oblivious, until he was close to it, that it was the night, Friday, on which alone the ghost had ever been seen. When he retired to his chamber that night, he shuddered at the recollection of what he had seen, and tried to remember all the persons whom he had ever heard of as having encountered the ghost, and what had become of them. There was old Tom Pentecost, the smith, but he was drunk when he saw it, and he had lived years afterwards. And young Joe Horsnail, who saw a ghost in every shifting light, and Patty Fairbrass, who had probably invented the story as an excuse for loitering in the precinct with her sweetheart, and these were both living still, and it was certainly more than a year since they met Nell Cook. So Walter gradually reasoned himself into a state of mental composure, and fell asleep. On the following morning, all Canterbury was thrown into an unwonted state of excitement by the discovery of a man lying dead in the brick walk, in a puddle of blood, which had flowed from a wound in the left side, evidently inflicted by the blood-stained clasp-knife which was lying open about a yard from the corpse. The ghastly object was carried to the dead-house, and the head constable took possession of the knife and gave notice to the coroner. The murdered man, for that murdered he had been there was no doubt, was identified as Miles Delaney, an idle, dissolute young man who had lost character, employment, and friends years before, and had then left the city and gone no one knew whither. Several persons had seen him in Canterbury during the 12 hours preceding midnight of the day before the corpse was found in the brick walk, and the constables became quietly busy in endeavouring to ascertain who was the last person in whose company he had been seen. Jenny, the girl who had delivered Delaney's scrawl to Walter Gilson, heard the description of the murdered man, and all the neighbours knew soon afterwards that such a man had brought to the house a letter for Mr. Barton's nephew. This was not long in reaching the ears of the head constable, and Walter received notice to attend the inquest. Being asked if he knew a man named Miles Delaney, he replied in the affirmative, And to the further question whether he had seen him on the day preceding the discovery of the murder, he answered that he had met him in the High Street in the afternoon, and that he had seen him again between 9 and 10 that night in the cloisters. "What took you to the cloisters?" inquired the coroner, regarding him very intently. "I had received a note from Delaney asking me to meet him there after dark," he replied. "Have you that note about you?" the coroner inquired. Walter hesitated for a moment, both because he could not remember on the instant what he had done with the note, and because he felt a natural unwillingness to have it read, and his countenance reddened as he produced the crumpled note from his pocket, smoothed it out, and gave it to the usher to hand to the coroner. "You say you met the deceased in the cloisters between 9 and 10, said that official, when he had read and re-read the scrawl very attentively. "Can't you tell us the time more nearly than that?" "The clocks were striking 9 when I entered the cloisters, but I waited there some time before Delaney came," Walter replied. "What time did you part?" "It must have been on the stroke of 10, replied Walter, after a few moments' reflection. "Where did you leave the deceased?" "In the cloisters." "I will not ask you what was the nature of your conversation, but there is one question I must ask you. Did you quarrel?" "Some angry words passed between us before we parted," Walter replied. "He tried to extort money from me, and threatened me, and I told him he might do his worst, but should have nothing." "And then—" The coroner paused, as if he wished the witness to say more. "Then I left him." "Show the witness the knife," said the coroner, and then the clasp knife with which the crime had been committed was handed to Walter by a constable. "Do you recognise it?" he asked, as the young man examined it with an air of interest. "It is like my own, and has the same initials engraved upon it," said Walter. "It is your own, is it not?" "Mine?" exclaimed Walter, with a start. "Is it possible that you suspect me of this foul crime? My own knife is in my pocket." His heart stood still for a moment, and his colour came and went in rapid alternations, as he vainly searched his pockets for his knife. It was gone. It was in vain that he tried to remember where he had left it. "I have no more questions to ask you," said the coroner, and he fell back, bewildered by the incident of the knife, among the eagerly listening auditors. No one else had seen Delaney, or been in or near the cloisters after 9 o'clock, and the investigation soon came to an end. The coroner summed up the evidence briefly, dwelling particularly upon the incident of the knife, and upon the admission of Walter Gilson that there had been a quarrel between the deceased and himself before they parted; and against that young man the jury returned a verdict of wilful murder. He was removed at once to Maidstone gaol, protesting his innocence, and sorrowing more for the grief and anxiety of Rose Barton than for himself, having no doubt that Providence would make his innocence manifest on his trial. Rose wept, but declared her firm assurance that he could not be guilty of so foul a crime. Her father expressed the same belief, but was far less confident than Walter or herself that the result of the trial would disprove the conclusion of the coroner's jury. Friends and neighbours merely shook their heads and said they could not have believed it. There was no new evidence offered on the trial. The prisoner had racked his memory in vain to remember where he had last used his knife, which had been searched for in every nook and corner of his uncle's premises without being found. He was prepared, therefore, for the verdict of guilty, and for the dread sentence which followed. "I have only to say that I am innocent of this man's death, and to express my confidence that the Almighty will, at some time or other, make my innocence manifest to the world," he had said, when asked whether he had aught to say in arrest of judgment. How shall I find words that would adequately express the anguish of poor Rose Barton? Like the Greek sculptor who found himself unable to represent to his satisfaction the grief of Agamemnon, I must draw over it a veil. 3 days after his conviction, Walter Gilson was hanged. Rose Barton shed no tear, but she secluded herself in her chamber, where she spent the day in prayer, and when she left it she was pale, but calm and resigned. From that day she was never seen to smile until— But to name the occasion would be to anticipate the sequel of my story. Lovely still, though pale and grave, she had many offers of marriage during the slow years that followed the great trouble of her young life, but she declined them all. Secluding herself in a great measure from society, she seldom left her home, but when she did, her chosen walk was nearly always the precinct of the cathedral. One evening in autumn, several years after the execution of her lover, she was walking in the cloisters when she heard a sharp and sudden cry from the direction of the brick walk, and as if wrung from the human breast by fear or pain of no ordinary degree. Running that way immediately, she found a man, tolerably well dressed, lying upon the walk as if in a fit. His cry had brought to the door of the house beside the dark entry a matronly-looking woman, who, on discovering the cause of the alarm, procured a jug of water, and dashed some of the cold fluid upon the man's face. "Doomed, doomed," he muttered, when the power of utterance returned, but without thorough consciousness of the situation. "Where do you live?" asked the canon's housekeeper in a kindly tone, while Rose Barton silently watched his countenance and waited for his answer. "Is it gone?" he asked, opening his eyes and looking around him with a scared expression upon his pallid countenance. "The ghost? It couldn't be his, for it was a woman." "Lord save us, he has seen Nell Cook!" exclaimed the elder woman. "His?" said Rose. "Ay, Miles Delaney's," returned the stranger, shuddering as he raised himself to a sitting posture, and again gazed around him. "What do you know of Miles Delaney?" inquired Rose, with difficulty repressing a burst of emotion. He glanced at her for a moment without speaking, and then rose to his feet. His mind was gradually recovering its balance. "I thought I saw a ghost," said he. "It was a foolish idea, but I have been ill, and am not quite myself. Thank you, I am all right now." "You shall not go until you have said what you know about Delaney," exclaimed Rose, endeavouring to detain him. The man immediately took to his heels, followed by Rose, crying, "Stop him!" But he had not run far when, not having quite recovered from the recent shock to his nerves, he staggered and fell. A clergyman came from one house, and a footboy from another. A constable was sent for, and the stranger, finding that he could not escape, became sullenly passive. "I charge him with the murder of Miles Delaney, ay, and with the murder of Walter Gilson too," said Rose, on the appearance of the constable. "Upon what evidence?" the constable asked. "God, who has given him up to justice, will give the evidence for his conviction," rejoined Rose impressively. "Take him," said the clergyman solemnly. "I believe the young lady is right." The stranger passively accompanied the constable to the gaol, where he was placed in a cell, seeming to be dazed by the suddenness and strangeness of the situation. He had not been there more than an hour when he expressed a wish to see the governor. "I wish to make a statement," said he, with the air of a man oppressed by the consciousness of heavy guilt. "It was I who murdered Miles Delaney. for which crime a young man of this city was hanged some years ago. I had an old grudge against him, and watched him into the cloisters. As I found afterwards, he had just been quarrelling with Gilson, and he was very savage. I did not mean to kill him. My idea was to get on the track of something that would enable me to hand him over to the law, but he taunted me so that I was provoked into striking him. Then he caught me by the throat, and I thought I should be strangled, so I whipped out my knife, opened it with my teeth, and let him have it between his ribs." "Where did you get that knife?" the governor of the gaol asked. "The initials on the haft were not yours." "I found it," replied the self-confessed murderer. "Then it may have been Gilson's after all," observed the governor. "Poor fellow!" There was no more to be said. The prisoner signed his confession, and the governor withdrew. When the gaoler visited the stranger's cell in the morning, he found him hanging from a bar of the grated window, and quite dead. Then it was that Rose Barton, on hearing of his confession, smiled once more, and raising her blue eyes heavenward, murmured, "The Lord has heard my prayer, and lifted the cloud from the name of the innocent." End of Chapter 9.